Have you ever wondered what your dreams mean? Join us in Dream School at thisjungianlife.com and find out. Jung wrote, "Dreams are a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul."
Dream School is a unique, self-paced online program you can start at any time that unlocks access to your inner world. Our 12-month program provides the support, knowledge, and guidance you need to reach within, decipher your personal dream code, and harness it to optimize your life. By enrolling, you'll join an affirming community of fellow travelers, each pursuing a unique quest.
And it's fun. Join us on an adventure to wholeness and healing through understanding your dreams. Go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Dream School. You'll be taken to our secure checkout. Once you join, you'll get immediate access to our first 3 modules. You can get started right away. We look forward to seeing you there.
Welcome to This Jungian Life. 3 good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we are going to discuss the Jungian concept of adaptation. And although it sounds maybe a little dry or somehow just theoretical, it's actually one of the most important tasks of both the first half of life and the second half of life. One side of this coin, heads, is adapting in the first half of life a lot to the external world and its realities, but also coming to terms with who you are and what you're suited for. And in the second half of life, adaptation entails adapting to one's own inner world and the unconscious. But as ever, we still live in the external world. So I do think of this as heads and tails of the same coin, whether it's outwardly or inwardly directed.
Yes, well, it's clear that Jung was talking about both adaptation to the inner and outer world, and there certainly is a way that those two things interact. I wanted to lift up a quote from Jung, not surprisingly, but I think it's really important, and it's also kind of lovely. He says, "Before individuation can be taken as a goal, the educational aim of adaptation to the necessary minimum of collective norms must first be attained. Mm-hmm. If a plant is to unfold its specific nature to the full, it must first be able to grow in the soil in which it is planted." So before we go leaping off into archetypal explorations or having big journeys into the unconscious, we need to be able to pay our rent and make our beds and have a relationship and hold a job. And Jung was pretty explicit about this.
And when he was talking about these adaptations in the first half of life, he was talking about typology. At a certain point, let's say by the time we're through elementary school, whether or not it's been recognized by our educators, we have already established a style of adapting to the world. We are either naturally an introvert or naturally an extrovert. We lead with our thinking function or we lead with our feeling function. And that partially based on what is rewarded and what is considered normal in the family, and then also where our talent for processing information lay, those things determine how we're going to shape and adapt. So for instance, my friends who are strong thinking functions, they adapt to the outer world by developing fairly rational criteria around why they will choose X versus Y. and they'll do some kind of research and they'll talk to themselves about it. If they're an introvert, they'll talk to themselves about it. If they're an extroverted thinker, they'll talk to their friends about it. But it'll still circle around these factual ideas. The three of us are more feeling typed, so we are more likely to talk about how our feeling evaluations come forward, how something makes us feel good or bad, or is appealing or not appealing, and how our nervous systems respond, perhaps in a more nuanced way. Talking to ourselves if we're introverts, talking to each other if we're extroverts. But all of that stuff needs to be honed so that we become more successful at using ourselves when we encounter the outer world.
Mm-hmm. So really, although adaptation is a noun, it's a very dynamic process of coming to terms with how do I process things, what do I value, what goes on inside me, and how do I evaluate that, and what are the requirements of the external world. This is the culture, the family, the clan, if you will, that I live in. So it's quite a task to keep all those various factors moving in a dynamic and also a balanced way that gives us some stability.
I think I'm resting into just how very big this concept is and how it's sort of like where the rubber meets the road in terms of being a human in a given life that's manifesting in space and time. This is the canvas on which we paint. Is we all come into the world in a certain form, in a certain time and place, with a certain family and certain external realities. And somehow it is our life task to adapt to those as well as we can in order to bring forth whatever it is inside us that needs to be born into the world through us. It is our own sort of epic task. It is the task of our whole life to learn to adapt. And as we'll talk about, I'm sure, to continue to adapt, because one of the things that's true is we may reach a certain level of adaptation, but we'll be challenged to readapt as our circumstances change and as we change. So it's a continuous process.
I think, as both of you are saying, the adaptation has to do with making room for things, and often making room for things that are immovable, whether they are immovable truths inside of ourselves, that we discover that we have a predisposition in a certain way, or unmovable tasks, unmovable situations, rather, in the outer world, that one simply has to find a way to dance with, regardless of whether it's pleasurable or painful.
Mm-hmm.
And that shapes our character.
Joseph, I like what you just said, and it reminds me of something that you like to say on the podcast. I mean, I really think that adaptation requires a certain amount of courage and a certain amount of willingness to meet the world on its own terms and to face reality as it is. So, Joseph, I love it when you say, reality is medicinal. And I think we're in that realm when we're talking about adaptation. As you alluded, some obstacles that we meet in the outer world are movable. We can figure out how to move those obstacles. Sometimes they're immovable, and we have to figure out how to go around them. But adaptation is the process of recognizing that which is immovable and movable and figuring out how we're going to deal with that.
And I think that includes very much our own internal world of the hope or dream or special ambition that one might have had, and the discovery that a certain amount of aptitude is simply not in me. That I really can't become an opera singer or a gymnast or an astronaut or, some of those really wonderful things that I might have dreamed of as a child. There are internal obstacles to that require, just as you said, the medicinal qualities of reality. And then disappointment and a kind of grieving process of, well, if those things are not going to be possible, what is? It may be something more mundane and more meaningful. It occurs to me that implicit in our discussion so far is adaptation to the first half of life.
Mm-hmm.
Coming to terms with who we are and what the outer world can offer us or will not offer us.
That nomenclature doesn't always work very cleanly for me, but I do want to follow up on that, Deb, and say that adaptation to the outer world is often a big thing that brings people into therapy, or I should say more specifically, problems with adaptation to the outer world is often something that brings people into therapy. So I'm having trouble consolidating a career, or I'm having difficulty finding a relationship, or any number of these kinds of things that are just sort of basic. This is the bread and butter of much therapy, including analysis, because this stuff matters. It seems kind of very quotidian, but it is the stuff of our lives. And so I'm thinking about the kinds of things that can limit outer adaptation. And I'm sticking right now just to outer for a second. So I'm thinking about kind of weak ego strength, making it difficult to just sort of meet the demands of life. Say if you have someone who feels very easily overwhelmed by challenges, that can make adaptation difficult. I think that limiting beliefs about ourselves can make adaptation difficult. If we believe that we're always going to fail, or that we can't possibly manage to work more than 6 hours a day, and otherwise we'll get too tired, that kind of thing can limit our ability to adapt. I think related to that is this notion of an external locus of control. I think that can sometimes make it difficult to adapt, although sometimes it actually is adaptive to have an external locus of control. But what I mean by that is, if you think that there's very little you can do to change your circumstances, in many cases, that's going to make it harder to adapt to the outer world. I think an overly rigid ego, if we only just have one way of moving through the world, we're too defensive or too fearful, that can make it difficult to adapt. So these are the kinds of things that we might see in a therapeutic process.
Yeah. I think related to your touching on ego is feelings that feel overwhelming and somehow consuming. That if anxieties come up and kind of take over, well, I can't do this because it's just too much for me. That's the other side of developing more ego strength, is developing the ability to have one's feelings of, yes, I feel very anxious about this new project, taking that new job, going into some new educational program, and I'm going to do it anyway.
So confidence plays some role in all of this. And I think in a much more psychologically informed world, parents are monitoring the level of confidence that their children have. They're careful to not interfere with the development of confidence as the toddler explores the world. It's, I think, an essential component. But the engine underneath that moment, Deb, is desire. That people often need to be able to libidinize an internal vision. And whether the vision is that I'm going to be in college, or that I'm going to graduate from college, or that I have an image of myself being successful in some way that is legitimately inspiring or activating, and that image can stay vibrant enough to draw us forward in the midst of anxiety and clumsiness and unskilledness, which is inevitable as we're kind of stumbling towards the new way of being. I can think of my first few weeks of college in my freshman year. I mean, I just felt like I was constantly slipping on a banana. Like every time I turned around, like I don't know where the books are. I don't know. I just felt like I didn't know anything about anything. And somehow we have to hold all of that anxiety and still find the energy to put one foot in front of another foot.
It's kind of about survival, isn't it? I mean, I appreciate what you're saying about desire, but there is this need to do what we have to do to survive. I mean, I think it's interesting that the word has a psychological connotation, but it also is a very important word in the field of evolutionary biology. We think about adaptation, and it's the species that adapt to a new environmental niche that manage to survive.
Yes, and I suppose a survival lens could be laid on, the first month of college as a freshman, to
Yeah,
survive
that's what I was thinking.
tasks.
Right. How do you survive?
How do we survive?
Well, I think, though, what we're talking about, since physical survival is not usually the case, is being able to withstand anxiety. I'm sure I can relate to your story, and I'm sure many people can as well, of being a freshman in college and going, oh my gosh, this is just really too much for me. I don't know what that guy in this class and that class is really talking about. I'm in over my head of how to manage that anxiety and remember that something drew you into this situation, get support, and survive psychologically and emotionally.
Well, it's like, what kind of inner and outer resources do you have?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would argue that it's not always anxiety. I mean, I think any number of difficult emotions can get in our way of adaptation. But you're right, there is something about being able to tolerate it and to keep going.
What other emotions do you imagine would be the challenge?
Oh, I mean, I think that fear could, or depression, or anger. I think that lots of these things could make it very difficult to move forward into life, because that's what we're talking about, really.
Yes.
The etymology of the word means literally to fit oneself to. And we are asked by life to fit oneself, to fit ourselves to particular situations that sometimes are incredibly challenging.
And so we're talking about skills and skill building. And what I think is a really wonderful scale to consider. And at one end, we have being unskilled, and at the other end, we have being highly skilled. And so much of our adaptation could be depersonalized a bit. We might be able to take some shame out of it by simply saying, well, I was less skilled then, and I'm more skilled now.
Yeah.
And all of them are skills. The skill of balancing a checkbook, or the skill of being able to call an office and make an appointment, the skill of asking for help.
The skill of managing overwhelming feelings.
Yes, being less skilled might look like, shouting and getting all upset inappropriately with people in the dorm. Being highly skilled might look like making sure that you get enough exercise and enough sleep so that you're not a raw nerve.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So we become, hopefully, more skilled. And I think what I find myself going into is the realm of coaching, that this kind of new industry has emerged. And I think this idea of skill and adaptation is really the purview now of coaches.
Adaptation to the external world.
Absolute, to the external world.
And there's no question that there can be an element of that in therapy and even in analysis. It's like, what do you need to remember to ask the doctor when you go there today?
Mm-hmm.
I'm very scared to go to the doctor. Let's make a list. I've done this with patients. What do you need to remember to ask the doctor when you go to see a psychiatrist this afternoon? What are you going to ask? Let's sit down and write the list.
Mm-hmm.
I came across this in the collected works and I thought it was really great. So I want to just lift this up. So one of the most common dream motifs that I'm sure we've all had, being somewhere and realizing that you're naked or you're not wearing the right, you're in your underwear or something like that. And Jung actually addresses this, and he said it usually indicates a lack of adaptation to the situation in which one finds oneself. So that, this is something we all struggle with.
Thinking about a dream like that, one sign of lack of adaptation is oversharing. That people will, let's say it's a business meeting or they're at a new job and they find themselves telling highly, highly personal information, which in a way is kind of stripping oneself down to one's underwear.
Right.
And getting a lot of strange looks from people and are suddenly feeling extremely uncomfortable and realizing that that was an unskilled use of one's personal history.
Yep. They call it TMI, too much information. TMI. But I'm also thinking that another maladaptation, two others are one, the sort of hell no, I won't go, not get into whatever that next maturational step is, whether it's education, relationship, employment, or a variation on that is the refusenik of digging one's heels in. And maybe the underlying feelings that you touched on before are the difference between fear and depression, thus avoiding it, versus anger, which is the refusenik stance.
Yeah, where people just sort of dig their heels in and just say, which I don't think is always anger, but anger is probably always there too when that happens. If, no, I'm not even going to try,
What I'm liking about our discussion that we're circling around again and again is that adaptation is doable. It's one step at a time. Think your way through it. Make a list. Where can you get help? Who can support you? That it's often very outer world, concrete, actionable steps that can help us get into the swim of life and the next step, because it's part of the individuation process.
Yes, it is. And maybe it's time to shift a little bit toward the ways in which an adaptation can be constricting. So, for example, we may find a way of moving through the world, perhaps in childhood or adolescence or young adulthood, that works for us. But eventually, this becomes an example of what Jung called kind of shoes too small for us. And that adaptation constricts us and keeps us from growing further. I think that trauma is a place where this happens. If we've had childhood trauma, we may have been required to split off a wounded child part of ourselves in the interest of adaptation, and that can carry us really far. I know some people who experienced trauma who were extraordinarily well adapted to the outer world, who high achieving, professionals, doing really well. But then at some point, that train that brought them into, say, midlife just breaks down. And then it's time to turn toward the inner world. I think in a way, this somewhat happened with Jung. I mean, he talks in his autobiography about personality 1 and personality 2. And personality 1 was kind of daylight consciousness personality. And he invested in that part of himself in sort of late adolescence, young adulthood. And he went to university and he went to medical school and he worked at the Berkeley and he satisfied the demands of Swiss society at that time, and he got married and he had kids and he was building up a professional career, all that kind of personality 1 stuff, all that adaptation to the outer world. And then he fell in his confrontation with the unconscious and then was very much attending to the demands of the inner world.
And I think that once the inner world activates aggressively, it can make demands on us that the outer world could criticize and find unsatisfying. For instance, it may be that there's a person who was highly social. The family depended on them. They were a community organizer within the extended family. And then somewhere in their 50s, something activates inside of them that requires a lot more time alone, meditating, writing, walking, talking to themselves. And the thought of planning big events for the family feels exhausting, or at least misdirecting where they want to be. It's actually not an uncommon scenario. But the family then starts to pressure the changing individual, starts to ask what's wrong.
Change back.
Change back. We rely on you to provide these things.
This was really convenient.
So we have a foot in the extended family. We have a foot in this emerging inner poet, for instance, that's coming forward. And there's a tension around how will I adapt, or how can I expect my environment to skillfully adapt to me, if it's possible. And there's always tension, creative tension, if we can be good-humored about it, in those reconfigurations.
I want to just pick up on that with a little fairy tale example, and also pulling back the idea that sometimes these adaptations that become very rigid and constricting can be the result of trauma. I'm thinking of the fairy tale Menifer, which has a much better German name that I won't even try to pronounce. Someday I'll learn how to pronounce that. But the fairy tale, just really quickly, it's kind of has an incest theme, and so she winds up running away from her father, who wants to marry her. And she's a princess. She's beautiful, but she covers herself in dirt and moss and all these different kinds of furs, and she looks kind of like a woodland creature. And she winds up going to a neighboring kingdom and working there as the scullery maid. But midway through the story, that adaptation of essentially hiding her physical beauty, which is exactly what people who've been incested will often do, is hide themselves beneath sometimes layers of excess weight, or they'll hide themselves in other ways. She doesn't need that anymore. It's too constricting. She doesn't need to be in the scullery maid position anymore. And so there's this process in the fairy tale of her beginning to expose herself for whom she is, and to appear in her kind of princess garb. This is something that we may need to do, is let go of these older adaptations that no longer serve us and in fact are keeping us small.
Yeah. The process of adaptation is lifelong. And we are meant to be dynamic, changing, and individuating creatures.
And that when we fail those tasks, we tend to become symptomatic. I can hear in the conversation that as we are supporting the idea of being well adaptive, it's a little more difficult to create lists of well-adapted behavior, because it's a little bit like fish describing water, that if things are well adapted, often they're very smooth. And if they're masterfully well adaptive, you barely even notice, because there's so little chafing going on. So sometimes it's easier to talk about maladaptive behaviors. We are much more aware of that. For instance, most addictions are thought to be maladaptive behaviors. For instance, I'm really, really anxious about going out and having a date. So, I'm going to have, 3 or 4 shots of scotch, before I leave, so that I'm slightly drunk by the time I arrive. So the adaptive tension is that, I have to somehow learn the skills that are necessary to tolerate the unknown, to tolerate both starting and sustaining conversations, to have a stable sense of self, so that I can tolerate perhaps criticism or the fact that a date may not go well, all of that stuff. And rather than learning how to dance with those factors, to just anesthetize the body so that we kind of stumble through an encounter without a lot of full participation in it.
Yeah, Joseph, I appreciate that you bring up this idea about things which are maladaptive. And of course, this is a word that is often used in sort of general psychology, people talk about maladaptive coping mechanisms, which I think you just gave a really good example of. So these might be things that we do to manage difficult emotions or difficult experiences, which may possibly work in the short term or bring some relief, but then carry negative consequences. I'm thinking about avoidance, which is a big coping mechanism for lots and lots of people. So if you've got, say, a high school student who has a big project coming up and it feels very overwhelming, and she decides she's going to binge watch Netflix instead of starting it, in the immediate term, that brings a sense of relief. And so in that sense, she is effectively coping with her sense of overwhelm. But we would call that a maladaptive way of coping with the overwhelm because, of course, in the long run, it carries a big consequence and it makes things worse. Again, which I think your example of using alcohol to manage a difficult social experience is very similar to that.
I think there are all kinds of things that people do that fall under the heading of what I think of as a palliative. Of, I'll just take a drink, or, I'll watch something on TV, or I'll just go to bed early tonight, or I'll do it over the weekend. Those are things that make us feel reassured and more at ease in the moment. They don't solve the problem. And not only that, it has to be repeated later. I'm going to need to watch another Netflix program or have another drink or whatever it is. And I would say if you find yourself doing something over and over again and it only works temporarily, it's probably a good clue that whatever needs to be adapted to has still not really been faced.
And anyone that's raised teenagers, particularly,
Oh my.
You're in the realm of helping a young person identify a maladaptive behavior and then providing resources and counsel and help, finding a better, more skilled way of responding to life's challenges. And I like Jung's language around adaptation when he says to come to terms with. And when I think about to come to terms with, that's actually how contracts are negotiated, that there are terms in a contract. So you have two parties that come together and they iron out the terms. And terms are basically promises and requests that we make a willful commitment and contract to. So part of, let's say, getting a teenager out of bed and in the shower and in the school bus by a particular amount of time, that it's a contract of terms, of promises and requests and rewards and even punishments. And if you look at most business contracts, they've got all that kind of language embedded.
Right. There's consequences.
Good and bad.
Yeah. Yes. And being able to manage those and anticipate them and make good decisions about them. I wonder if we could move a little bit into this idea about adaptation to the inner world. Jung says a couple of good things about this. He says, regression is an adaptation to the conditions of the inner world, and it springs from the vital need to satisfy the demands of individuation. Man is not a machine in the sense that he can consistently maintain the same output of work. He can meet the demands of outer necessity in an ideal way only if he is also adapted to his own inner world, that is, if he is in harmony with himself. So Jung is bringing a very specific additional dimension to this idea of adaptation. I mean, as we've been talking about, adaptation has this kind of very bread and butter kind of meaning about just getting by in your life. Jung brings this additional layer that we also have to be in harmony with ourselves. We have to be adapted to the demands of the inner world. We have to be in relationship with the unconscious in order to really do a good job of being adapted to the outer world. And I want to just bring in another fairy tale motif here for a second. I'm thinking of fairy tales very common motif where there are four brothers and there's some task that needs to be done. And the first three brothers all set out, and the king is very happy to let them go and do their thing, and he has high hopes for them, and they get the horse and go out and have the hero's journey, go out on the quest, but each of them fails. And then it's the youngest son in Russian fairy tales. He's usually named Ivan, but he's the dumbling. He's sort of the fool. He's the one who's always just lying by the fire, warming his feet by the fire in the Russian fairy tales. And he says, "Father, I'd like to go." And the king says, the czar says, "No, you're good for nothing. You just lay by the fire. What do you know? You're going to fail." But he finally prevails on his father to give him a horse too, so that he can go try his hand. And inevitably, he is the one who succeeds. Why does he succeed? Usually in these fairy tales, what happens to the first three or two or three brothers, depending on the tale, is they ignore the advice of the talking animal or the little gnome or the old woman, whereas Ivan, or the youngest, the dumbling, attends to it in some way. So it is the youngest son in these stories. It's the dumbling who is actually adapted to the inner world. From an outer world ego perspective, he looks like a ne'er-do-well or just a lazy bum. But really, he knows something about being in harmony with oneself. And he is therefore, in the end, better able to be adapted to the outer world and to complete the hero's quest.
This goes back to what we touched on before about having an overdeveloped or too rigid ego, that the older brothers, quote, know better than to engage the talking animal or the old hag sitting under an oak tree. They're overly ego-oriented. Whereas the dumbling has a connection with the inner world, with the unconscious, that is always outpictured in these fairy tales as the old hag or the talking fish, or some strange creature that they encounter in the forest.
So when I think about the adaptation to the inner world, it always circles around a core question: what do I want? Which is so simple linguistically and is often a paralyzingly difficult thing for people to answer. But it's probably the most defining process that one could engage. So that's where I would start. What do you want? In any realm, in all the realms,
Mm-hmm.
and then to sit with what you think you want and to circle around it in the imagination and see whether or not it fully holds the energy that you hope it will. And if not, then you have to go deeper, that you've kind of settled for a short shot,
Mm-hmm.
but actually there's something else underneath it that it's pointing to that is much more profound.
Mm-hmm.
This validation of what we want creates a certain kind of creative tension between the inner and outer adaptations. When we live a life of desire, so to speak, a life organized around what we authentically want, there are highly specific inner and outer adaptations that are required, that are unique to the journey that you are bringing forward in the world, versus, let's say, the rules and regulations you learned through elementary school, which are kind of adaptations that the entire culture expects from you generically. So we become increasingly refined and defined by asking this question over and again: what do I want?
I often work with people engaging that very question by making the next step kind of smaller. What do you want as a kind of a dream? What do you want to do this weekend? what special meal or special place would you like to have or visit? So that the person can get in touch with desire in a small way of, oh, I would really like to go here. I would really like to visit that. I would really like to fill in the blank, so that it's an easier little handhold, so to speak, in the internal world of feeling. And that connects with libido, or energy for life, of something that will pull him or her into a step.
I hear what you're saying about desire, but sometimes I think that adapting to the inner world, or maybe the demand to adapt to the inner world, takes a slightly different form. And I'm thinking about someone that I worked with a while ago who had been, very successfully adapted to the outer world, kind of went to college and did well, and then got a job and had a career, and was going along fine, but then met with a disappointment in romantic relationships. And so that's a kind of obstacle to outer adaptation. But what she found was that she got thrown into a deep depression. She really just, it was like some force took her up and just cast her into Hades. And it had a deeper, more comprehensive feel to it than being just about the failed relationship. It called into question everything. All of her former modes of adaptation were now suddenly under review. It wasn't clear anymore that she wanted to continue in the career that she was in. And so she was pulled into a profound inner confrontation. And this is, when she came into analysis, she suddenly got interested in her dreams. She was paying attention to all kinds of feelings and fantasy images that she never really had paid much attention to before. So when this one thing failed in the outer world, then there was this thing that Jung talks about, this regression of libido into the inner world. And we do think of that as a depression, but it was also a demand to meet these forces in the inner world that wanted something different than the nice little path that she had been on. So she was actually headed toward a graduate degree in the sciences. She was all set to do that. And then when this happened, it's just like she sort of fell off the map, and she's like, well, I don't know. I don't even know that I want to do that anymore. So there was desire in there, sure, but that wasn't what initiated her into this process. She had to go through this kind of Night-Sea journey in a way before she could come to and here's something I desire.
Yeah, that's a really important example and path that you've pointed out, Lisa, and how when our world is shattered and everything feels like it's all just thrown up in the air, that kind of regression and depression and attention to the inner world can open up a new opportunity. I suppose the flip side is that it could revert back to a previous style of adaptation. But that Night-Sea journey into the underworld, Jonah being swallowed by the whale, it is sometimes a very creative, if difficult, engagement and encounter with the unconscious, and can lead us into not only a different career path or a different relationship, but a different orientation to ourselves.
So the Night-Sea journey of that young person, for me, was a purification process. That when we are thrust into the unconscious and we come up against the hidden factors that are pushing and churning our lives up to that point, we often discover what has colonized us versus what we really want, or what the self wants through us. and we're colonized by thousands of things. Childhood fantasies that are inspired by friends or family members or books we've read or any number of things that come into us from the outside that gain traction, that may be legitimately worthy of our attention and appealing. But if they're not generated or fueled by the self, they are still somehow lacking a taproot. And if we're lucky enough to catch the sense of that before we get too far down that road of commitment, then there's a purifying, clarifying process where we can reel ourselves back in, find the deeper connection, and then reissue forward, and often find that we have more energy, that things move more in our direction, that the wind is more at our back when we step forward with the self at our side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in a way, it was a blessing that this outer adaptation regarding relationship failed because it invited her into that process, and she didn't get too far down the road, right? The further down the road we get in the false adaptation, I want to say, with maybe using quotes there, or the temporary adaptation, perhaps, we're more invested in it, and it gets harder sometimes to break away from that and seek what's underneath that. But the inner world, the self, will demand that we do so. And, I think we see this showing up in fairy tales, that something will reach up from underneath and grab us and say, now I demand that you deal with me. You've put me off for a long time now, but now I must be dealt with. Sometimes that comes up through symptoms. Sometimes that imagery comes up through dreams.
I think recurring dreams are a good example of being haunted by the self. That something keeps chasing us, which often is our fate.
Mm-hmm.
Our authenticity. And I liked what you said, Joseph, of what wants to come into the world through us. That is our own unique expression of self, and also our connection to something greater, which is the self with a capital S, which you've just been mentioning.
And an adaptive attitude that can rise from the sense of what does the self want to bring forward through me is that I am responsible for that I have been tasked by something that is greater than myself to give birth to this and to tend it responsibly. And in order to do that, we may find ourselves suddenly going back to school to get another master's degree, or suddenly relocating, or letting go of several things, opening a new business, or withdrawing from the world into a writer's retreat. But that inner clarity demands that we become responsible in the outer world and that we make changes. And those changes can feel costly. And if we're well companioned by the inner, they can also feel euphoric.
Yeah, Jim Hollis has this great quote that I love. He says, we all have an appointment with ourselves, but most of us don't show up for it. And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, this sense that we're meeting the demands of the inner world. But it can be genuinely quite tumultuous. I mean, I think that's what happened to Jung in his confrontation with the unconscious. And he talks a lot about that, he talks a lot about regression into the inner world as a kind of, when an outer adaptation fails, there's regression into the inner world, which ignites these kind of archaic levels of the psyche and brings up archetypal imagery. And he talks a lot about this in volume 5, which kind of prefigured his own plunge into the unconscious. And it's pretty clear, he says in volume 5 in several different places and in several different ways that this is kind of dangerous because you could go into the inner world and you could get stuck there. So this regression is perilous. It may activate heretofore untapped inner resources but it's not without some danger. And I do think that we see this. Sometimes you see someone fail in an outer world adaptation, and there is a kind of regression, and they don't really fully come back. And that's when what it can look like is maybe someone who started life off well. He went to college, maybe he got a master's degree, maybe he started off down the road toward consolidating a career, but then something happened. There was a failure of some kind. He didn't get a promotion, he didn't get a job, he lost a job. And then he kind of gets stuck. And then 10 years later, he's gone from being a barista at Starbucks maybe to being a manager, but he's not working in his chosen career and he hasn't moved on to a different one. And I mean, no disparagement meant to people who manage Starbucks. Just sort of crafting a hypothetical example here of someone who hasn't managed to reassert that energy into a forward-moving trajectory in his life.
I think too of other people that I've known where I feel that the first half of life was very successful, but the transition into the inner world wasn't. And I'm thinking of a person that I knew in my personal life who did amazing things as a young woman, of left her country of origin, came to the United States, got married, had children. They had to move a number of times. She always did it incredibly successful. And then when her children were grown, simply did not know what to do next. The outer world life adventures and things that needed to be dealt with had been a terrific fit for her. Social work theory always talks about goodness of fit. But the turn inward into the internal world, which I hear you, Lisa, it can be perilous in some respects, but gosh, it's so rich as well. That is an important source of life and meaning and depth in our lives. That empty nest period is what I think it's commonly called. And what else wants to come into the world through you after your children, your birds have flown?
I think of that transition as a really great example of the completion of the outer adaptation, which then creates the space for the inner demands to begin to be heard. I think that when, as a young mother or young father, you're cast into caring for children, making a home, carving out the cultural expectations, there's such a clamor for outer relationship, such a clamor to meet all kinds of needs, that small voice of the self really either can't be heard or maybe even beneficently withholds itself, takes a silent stand, so that we have the bandwidth in order to meet what the culture requires of us, to meet perhaps even our biological imperative. And then when things quiet down, the self has an opportunity to really just step into the empty space and say, it's my turn.
And I wonder if that's a good place to leave it for now and switch over to a dream.
Hi, this is Lisa from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Deb, and I have been deeply moved by your responses to our work. Producing, editing, and distributing the podcast involves substantial expenses, and we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month, and at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Thank you.
The dreamer is a 43-year-old female She is a psychologist and a development professional, and here is her dream. I'm standing outside of a pool, and my sons, 6 and 10 years old respectively, are in the pool with my ex-husband. My mother is sitting near me. I realize I need to go to the bathroom and shout to my ex-husband to take care of our youngest son. As I turn my back at the pool, I see a frog man. He has the body of a man and the head of a frog. He's sitting as a frog on the floor. I'm surprised and fascinated by it. His skin is dark blue with small light green and light blue freckles. His eyes are green. It's raining and he seems to be enjoying the water. I call my brother so he can see the creature. My brother appears as a little boy, and the frog man sits at a table with my brother and asks him many questions about his origin. The frogman speaks to my brother while I go to the bathroom. When I return, the frogman is sitting on a small stairway as if he's waiting for me. I see him, and I ask if I can touch his skin. He lets me touch his arm. It's shiny and beautiful like a night full of stars. I don't remember if I kiss him or hug him. He asked me to go with him, and I tell him that I have other things to do. I walk down the street and find a busy avenue with heavy traffic. I have to cross to the other side, but it seems hard, like a complex coordination of moves and traffic lights. I see the frogman walking on the other side of the avenue. And for context, she writes, I separated from my ex-husband before COVID-19 hit. I've been dealing with teleworking and homeschooling, chores for many months now. The divorce process is stuck because my ex-husband doesn't want to review the legal documents, and I want to close the chapter and move on. In the dream, her main feelings were fascination and surprise. And she adds that she's recently been talking again to a friend that's working abroad, that he contacted her to recommend a book, and that they've been calling each other often. She likes him, they talk for hours. They're both going through a divorce and they're trying to understand what's happening in their marriages. Sometimes it feels as if they're dating. There's flirting on both sides, but mostly it's friendly conversation. She notices that these calls have brought a different energy to her life, and once again she's wondering about love and relationships. The two of them speak a lot about psychology and share dreams.
What comes up for me right away is remembering the movie The Shape of Water, where this fascinating, unusual, and with a certain kind of special skin creature. He's been captured, but he comes from a river somewhere off the coast of South America or something. So there's a numinosity here to this this person, this man, who's part frog and part man, and his dark blue skin.
Well, we're certainly in the realm of an archetype here. This is an kind of archetypal dream of this frog man. And I was wondering if there were any kind of mythological half man, half frog creatures. I'm having trouble thinking of one.
Well, of course, there's the frog in the story about the little princess, the talking frog who retrieves her golden ball. And there are a number of tales about talking fish. So I'm thinking that it's not maybe so, it doesn't have to be that specific to frog, although I'm curious about what that symbolism is, as much as here is an image of something from the unconscious that has come into visibility and interaction with ego. She sees him. There's even more water because it's raining and he's enjoying the water. She wants her brother to come and see the creature. The rain and her need to go to the bathroom, other sort of watery processes, if you will. She wants to touch him. doesn't remember if she kisses or hugs him, but when he asks her to go with him, she tells him she has other things to do. And then all of a sudden, she's on a street with busy traffic.
So I'm wanting to start right from the beginning with this dream and note that she is standing outside of a pool while her sons and her ex-husband are in the pool. So first of all, we have a quaternity right there in the beginning, the kind of three masculine figures and then the ego. And the three masculine figures are in the water and she is standing outside the water. Her mother is sitting near her. So there's something here about the mother complex. Then she shouts to her ex-husband to take care of the youngest son. So she's kind of commending the youngest son to the care of the ex-husband. It sounds like from the context, she's been doing a heck of a lot of caretaking. And now she's finally saying, hey, you take care of him. So I wonder about that. I wonder if there's kind of a real world reference there that she's feeling spent. It's when she tells her ex-husband to look after the youngest child, then she turns around and she sees the frog or the frogman. So something about allowing herself to turn her back on her children momentarily after making sure they're being cared for by her ex-husband allows this new, very startling, surprising, and delightful energy to be present. And I do wonder if that maps on to what she says in the context that she's begun this, it sounds like renewing, revivifying contact with this old friend, is it, I think? This man that she's having some phone conversations with. So there's something kind of fresh and new. There's new life here. You know, frogs are very associated with new life or something coming back to life. They lay their eggs in the water and, you know, numerous eggs in the water. They sort of can spontaneously come back to life after being kind of frozen in the mud all winter. So there's some fresh life here that's drinking up this rain and enjoying it and enjoying the water, enjoying the feeling. But it does come into her awareness after she turns her back on her kids in the pool.
Well, I'm with you on that, and I'm also finding myself thinking about the hero's journey. And isn't it that there's the call to adventure, and then there is the refusal of the call? And she's right there at the beginning where the frogman asks her to go on a journey, and she says, no, I won't do that. So she's still in the departure phase of the hero's journey. And that seems right for me, as she's still in the transition out of her old marriage, perhaps out of a level of her own identity. And then, of course, everybody who's dealing with these adaptations to COVID and what that means for our career, socializing, dating over Zoom, all the stuff that people do.
Right. And the stuff with kids, I mean, that is no joke. If you've got kids suddenly at home all the time trying to do school on the computer, it's really burdensome.
So often in myths around the hero, that the call is given and the future heroine refuses to heed it. And that is often out of a sense of duty or obligation, perhaps even the duty or obligation to her children, or the biological, the family of origin with the brother. Also, the heroine often feels fear or insecurity or inadequacy. And the whole conflict is the person is clinging to their current circumstances. And here's a quote from Campbell, Joseph Campbell, who's kind of the grand master of the hero's journey. He says, refusal of the summons converts the adventure into its negative. Walled in boredom, hard work, or culture, the subject loses the power of significant affirmative action and becomes a victim to be saved. his flowering world becomes a wasteland of dry stones, and his life feels meaningless, even though, like King Minos, he may, through titanic effort, succeed in building an empire of renown. Whatever house he builds, it will be a house of death, a labyrinth of cyclopean walls to hide from him his minotaur. All he can do is create new problems for himself and await the gradual approach of his disintegration. It's a pretty ominous
Oh my goodness.
quote there.
But actually, it sounds like Campbell is really talking about what we were just talking about, which is no matter how well adapted you are to the outer world, if you're not adapted to the inner world, it's going to kind of become flat and devoid of meaning. I mean, I think that, Joseph, you're right in applying this to this dream in some way. I wonder if the initial setting in the dream where she's sitting by the pool and her kids and her ex-husband are in it, if it isn't kind of being ruled over by the mother principle, and that's why the mother is sitting there.
Mm-hmm.
And she's in this very kind of motherly, maternal role that is necessary, but it is obviously constricting. You know, the thing is, because the ex-husband and the two kids are in her life every day in a very present way, there is this way that this part of the dream could not be very symbolic. It's like, when you've got a 6-year-old in the pool, you cannot look away, unless that kid is already a good swimmer. But if the kid, and a lot of 6-year-olds are not particularly strong swimmers, you have to really, really just not take your eyes off that kid. So this is a big deal to be turning her back on the pool when her 6-year-old is in. And I note that she says to her husband, take care of her younger son. And it shows, and she sort of hasn't, what I get from the context is it doesn't sound like she's getting that much help maybe from the ex-husband, or it feels like she's not. I'm not sure if I am making that up. The ego has the strength to kind of make that demand on the ex-husband. Here, you look after them for a while. I need to go do this necessary thing of going to the bathroom. And this is something that might actually happen if you were at the pool with kids. It's like, I got to go, but someone else, I have this biological reality here that I'm facing, but someone else has to look after this kid. And when she's able to turn her back momentarily on this mother world role, then she is greeted by this really delightful, numinous energy that I think is coming into her life in the new relationship. But of course, it's more. It's not just about this new potential relationship. It's about a whole new kind of energy that's creative and fecund. And I thought it was so beautiful. It's like a night of shining stars on this skin, and this green, and these greens and blues. It sounds really, really beautiful. So there's something here that's from an archaic level of the psyche that is calling her towards a renewed kind of life. And you're exactly right, Joseph, that I think it's kind of the call.
Yeah.
And can she welcome it in? Now, I think the brother is probably kind of an image of a tender, new, animus energy. He's about 10 years old in the dream. It's interesting. He comes back as this little boy, right? And he's tended to by the frogman, who asks him questions about his origin. So we also kind of have a lot of child archetype stuff here, which we know is about futurity and future possibilities that are just coming into life.
I'm aware of the theme of I have to go in this dream. At the very beginning, I realized I need to go to the bathroom. Then the frogman appears. And the brother appears while I go to the bathroom. So that's a very mundane kind of everyday need that we can all relate to. But there it is, while I go. And then at the end, the frogman asks her to go with him. And again, she says, I have other things to do. So you've touched so well on all the mothering obligations. I'm aware of, at the end, of the busy traffic and the street, it's such a change of scene into a depiction of the world of civilization and attention and ego kinds of endeavors. However, she sees the frogman walking on the other side of the avenue. So that energy and the call of where she needs to go is still there.
Yes, there's an opportunity for her to commit to the quest. It hasn't totally disappeared from her hands, and that the frogman is still findable. Taking in account the comments that you'd said, I can imagine that the appearance of the brother signifies her transition from the mother attitude to the sister attitude. And there's something about being a sister that may allow her to feel more adventurous, to feel that she has more options. So when she's bound to the mother complex, the ex-husband, the psychological responsibilities of the children, because we're keeping this in the symbolic level. Nobody's saying that she has to abandon her children, and nor is the dream suggesting that. Yeah. The dream's mythic because we've got men with frogs' heads running around. But it may very well be that she has allowed her mother role, and even perhaps the memories of her own biological mother, to take up too much real estate in her own psychological process, so that she's perhaps even having trouble imagining other ways of being, other psychological stances that she might take, which would not harm her children in any way.
And Joseph, I think that's exactly right. And my fantasy is that that's part of what she's getting in these conversations with this old friend. They're talking about psychology. They're talking about dreams. She's not in that sort of, okay, now it's time to do your homework and brush your teeth place. Mm-hmm. She's found this like wonderfully squishy, delightful, oozy energy place, mm-hmm. and you're right. We can access that and still do what we need to do to parent.
Right, so she can remember the sister part of herself, which is a different way of being in relationship. The frog prince, so to speak, the frogman makes an overture, says, let's go on an adventure. She says no. And the frog prince is now still kind of stalking her interestingly from across the way. After the refusal of the call, in terms of the archetype, then once the hero has committed to the quest, and the commitment can be conscious or unconscious, but something has decided, yes, I'll do this, then a magical helper appears. To me, even though she says, I've got other things to do and walks down the street, there's still magic happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's an opportunity for her to take mm-hmm. another step in the yes direction and see where this is going. And speaking very pragmatically, this is still available in terms of active imagination.
Yes, absolutely.
For the dreamer to practice going into these deep, relaxed states, to replay the dream from the beginning as if it's a kind of theatrical event in your mind. And at the end, when you're standing there seeing the frogman across the street, make a decision about that. And at the risk of being intrusive, make a decision to perhaps go and talk more with him, to perhaps say yes, and to let him take you on a journey, or at least to talk more about what that might mean with him.
Right. He's now an inner figure that you can turn to and converse with when you need guidance. And I might also suggest that you try to paint or draw this image. It's so striking and it sounds really beautiful.
Yeah. It's new life.
Or get a tattoo on your neck.
Oh, no.
What? No. Everyone would admire it.
No, don't do that.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.